Well, last month marked the 240th anniversary of what is recognized as the first ever hot air balloon. There's a painting of that very event on the screen. Here's an article from Today in the World about that. On June 4th, 1783, at the market square of a French village not far from Paris, a smoky bonfire on a raised platform was fed by wet straw and old wool rags. Tethered above, straining its lines, was a huge taffeta bag 33 feet in diameter. In the presence of a respectable assembly and a great many people, and accompanied by great cheering, the balloon was cut from its moorings and set free to rise majestically into the noon sky. 6,000 feet into the air it went, the first public ascent of a balloon, the first step in the history of human flight. It came to Earth several miles away in a field, where it was promptly attacked by pitchfork-waving peasants and torn to pieces as an instrument of evil. What a crazy ending. You can't really blame the peasants. They'd never seen anything like it before. And yet, that is the response they got. Just a few months later, by the way, it was either November or October, the reports differ, was the first manned flight of a balloon, where they actually had somebody brave enough to go up in that balloon, and they were smart enough to take champagne bottles with them. As soon as they landed, they started handing champagne bottles to the peasants so they wouldn't get attacked by pitchforks. A crazy story, when something new comes along, when change comes, sometimes it's really hard to deal with. Somebody said life is a continuous process of getting used to the things we didn't expect. And I think there is some truth to that. Change can be difficult, especially when it comes to a change in leadership. And we're going to be facing that. And it means sometimes some adjustments that could be hard. And so it's going to require from us some adjustments, some of them that may be hard on us. There's a story in 2 Samuel that illustrates that thought. And I have to tell you the background to this message, because I outlined the book of 1 Samuel that we've been preaching in for the last 20-some weeks in either late December or early January. And I got to the end of that outline, and I had this thought that, even if I'm going to be preaching in 2 Samuel, I don't want to end 1 Samuel on this really sour note of Saul's death. And you can go back to last week's message if you don't know about that. And so I decided, because all of 1 Samuel, we called it politics and providence, is God working through politics to bring about the king, the dynasty that he wanted in place. And I thought it's a bad place to end where that book ends. So we're going to go into the first couple chapters of 2 Samuel to end this whole series. Now, that was outlined way back in January before we ever started talking about a merger with Front Range Calvary. And a few weeks ago, I was realizing we only have a couple of Sundays left before we actually have our merger. And it occurred, I wonder if I should say something different. I wonder if I should not do that message because it's in 2 Samuel, and I began to think about that, and it occurred to me there couldn't be anything better, because what the people are facing in Israel is a change of leadership that requires some adjustments. And there are some lessons in this that I think we can learn from it. And so I just think that's a God timing story that is just amazing to me when I think about it. So I want you to open your Bibles, your devices, to 2 Samuel. We're going to look at chapters 1 and 2 today. I don't have much of the passage in if you use the Bible app notes or the church app notes. I only put one key verse in there. I didn't put everything else. I'm going to read a pretty good chunk. So if you want to follow along, you want to open your Bibles or open your devices to a Bible so that you can follow along in that. Before we jump into 2 Samuel 1, though, a little bit of review will help. You'll have to remember that the Israelite and Philistine armies had gathered for battle. They were lining up against each other, and the last few weeks, a number of stories that happened while that was taking place are what we looked at. And finally, last week, they began their battle against each other. And if you know the story, if you're here last week, Israel suffered a huge defeat, just as Samuel had predicted was going to happen. A huge defeat. Chapter 31, verse 6 kind of summarizes the whole thing. Thus Saul died, the king, his 3 sons, and his armor bearer, and all his men on the same day together. That pretty much summarizes the battle. King Saul, his sons, his armor bearer, all his men, they all died on the same day in that battle. It was a horrible defeat for Israel. Now you have to remember that David wasn't there. If you go back to the story, if you're here, you'll remember that David had fled from Saul and was living with the Philistines, with Saul's enemies. And when they were lining up for battle, David was ready to go into battle. We don't know if he was planning to attack the Philistines from within or where his mind was. We aren't told. But he was in a very difficult position. And he was able to get out of that position because some of the rulers of the Philistines didn't want him there. They were afraid he would do exactly that, attack them from within. And so he was relieved of that position, fortunately for him. And he went back to where he was living, the town of Ziklag, and found the town, if you remember, burned and attacked, and plunder and wives and children taken. And so David and his men went on a campaign to recover that plunder and those people. And so David and his men have no idea what's happening or what happened on the battlefield between Israel and the Philistines. They have no idea. They're just waiting for word. They couldn't get on the internet and look, so they just had to wait for somebody to come. And that's where the story today picks up. But you have to remember that Saul was dead. That's the key thing in today's story. Saul had died, and so had Jonathan. Many people would have thought Jonathan was the heir to the throne, the oldest son. He too was dead. And so there's going to be a change in leadership. And that's what happens in 2 Samuel. In 2 Samuel, David hears the news. And the story that David hears, we mentioned this last week, the story that David heard is not the same one that's reported in 1 Samuel chapter 31. He hears a different story. Let me read to you the story. I'm going to read a pretty good chunk. I'm going to read verses 2 through 10 in 2 Samuel chapter 1. You can listen to the story. If you were here last week, try to note some of the differences. On the 3rd day after they had gotten back from this attack that they went on, behold, a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. And when he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. And David said to him, "Where do you come from?" And he said, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." And so David said to him, "How did it go? Tell me." And he answered, "The people fled from the battle. And also many of the people have fallen and are dead. And Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." And then David said to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" And the young man who told him said, "By chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa. And there was Saul leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me, and he called to me. And I answered, 'Here I am.' And he said to me, 'Kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers.' So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown, I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord." Now, there's some differences between this story and the one we read last week. Remember, last week is the story of the author, the narrator of 1 and 2 Samuel. It was originally all one big book, but it didn't fit on one scroll, so it's now 2. So it's just a continuation of the same story. Well, the last one was the narrator telling us the story. So we believe that that's the true story, and yet what we see here is a different story. Here's some of the differences. In the chapter 31, Saul had asked his armor bearer to kill him because he had been hit with an arrow. He was badly wounded. He knew he wouldn't escape from the Philistines. Excuse me. So sorry about that, guys. So he asked his armor bearer to kill him so he wouldn't suffer at the hand of the Philistines. The armor bearer, as we pointed out last week, his main job was to protect the life of the king. He said, "No, I won't do that." And so Saul pulled out his sword and killed himself. But in this story, Saul asked this Amalekite who happened to be walking by to kill him. And the Amalekite said that he would do that, and so he did that. And he says he picked up Saul's crown and his armlet and brought them to David. There's some important things to notice about that story. One is this, that this Amalekite shows up in clothes of mourning. Torn clothes, dirt on his head. That's how people dressed when they were in mourning in that culture. I want you to notice that he brings the crown to David. He certainly was there either when Saul died or immediately afterwards, or he wouldn't have had those things. And so he had to have been very close by. But he thinks that David will appreciate it. Somehow he knows that David had been anointed the next king. He thinks David will appreciate him bringing these things to him. And it says he bowed down and paid homage to David. What I want you to notice also is he takes credit for Saul's death. And there's absolutely no remorse in that whatsoever. He takes credit for Saul's death as though he is the hero of the story. There's another interesting thing to note. I didn't catch this, but one of the commentators pointed it out. In fact, I heard it I found Alistair Begg addressing this chapter, and I had to listen to it. And he points this out as well. He says, notice what this man is called. 3 times he is called, verse 5 and 6 and 13, the young man who told him. The young man who told him. 3 times the narrator calls this young man that. And it's as though he's making a point to say, this is what was told, but it's not the true story. This is what was told, but it's not true. Think about this for a minute. What are the chances of this story? First of all, what are the chances that Saul had no one else to ask to kill him? Remember, he was the king, and in battle, all the champions gathered around the king, and their job was to protect the king. And if they weren't there, they were all dead, and if they were dead, Saul would have been dead already. And so why was there nobody there that Saul had to turn around and ask this young man who wasn't a part of his army to kill him? And why was this guy just happened, as he said, to be out on a stroll on Mount Gilboa in the middle of a nasty battle? How often does that happen? Oh, there's a battle outside. I'm going to go for a walk. You know, the chances of this story being true are just simply not there. He was making up a story because he was expecting a reward from David. That's what's happening here. People point to these 2 stories and say, look how the Bible contradicts itself, but it's so clear what's going on. He's making up a story because he wants a reward. Boy, was he surprised. He got a reward, all right. If you know the story, you know where it's going. Look at verses 13 to 16. David said to the young man who told him, there's that phrase again, where did you come from? And he answered, I'm the son of a sojourner, an Amalekite. By the way, that meant he was a legal alien in Israel. He had all the protections of Israelite citizens, so he didn't need anything special. He said, I'm a son of a sojourner. And David said to him, how is it that you are not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? And David called one of the young men and said, go and execute him. And he struck him down so that he died. And David said to him, your blood be on your own head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. Yeah, he got a reward, all right. He got killed for the story that he gave. You know, some say David killed this young man for political purposes because it's going to look really good if he kills the guy that killed Saul. It's not going to look good if he rewards him. And so some people say he did it for political purposes. But you know David's character by now as we've gone through this story. He constantly was coming back to the fact that Saul was God's anointed ruler and he would do nothing to harm him. He came back to that numerous times, and twice he had the opportunity to kill Saul, and he refused because he said, Saul is the Lord's anointed. He's been consistent from beginning to end to say, we don't harm the Lord's anointed. And so what he did was simply punishment for what this guy claimed to have done. Had nothing to do with political purposes whatsoever. And so David hears the news and he kills the messenger. They say don't kill the messenger, but in this case it was necessary. So what did David do? Then he lamented for Saul and Jonathan. Not just for Jonathan, his friend, but for Saul, the king. The very king who was so jealous of David that he was out to kill him. And yet, David mourns for him. I skipped verses 11 and 12. Look at those verses. David took hold of his clothes and he tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and they wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. They are mourning. And David tells his men to mourn, not just for his friend Jonathan, but for Saul, who was killed as well. You surprised? If you're surprised, I'll tell you something. The readers of this day, when this was written, were probably even more surprised. And the reason they were probably more surprised is because the tradition was that women sang the laments at the funerals. Men never did. It was always the women. And in verses 17 to 27, David sings a lament for Saul and Jonathan. And so it's a very unusual thing in that culture that's going on. Some really colorful expressions are in this passage. If you have your Bibles, digital Bibles don't often do this, but if you have a print Bible, you'll see it's in poetic form because it's a psalm that David wrote. And he wrote it for this very event. It says he told the people that they should learn it. And some of the colorful expressions that are in it, verse 19, your glory, O Israel, is slain on the high places. He calls Saul the king, the royal family, your glory, Israel. A beautiful expression. In verse 20, he says, tell it not in Gath, that's the leading city of the Philistines, or on the streets of Ashkelon. Let the daughters of the Philistines, or lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. We don't want the enemy to know what's going on because we don't want them to rejoice. By the way, it's interesting that David had been living for many months in Philistine territory with one of the Philistine kings, and yet it's very clear that his sympathies were still with Israel because he doesn't want the news of Saul's death to go out, so they rejoice over him. Some beautiful language in that. Verse 21, it says, the shield of the mighty was defiled. The shield of Saul was not anointed with oil. That's an interesting expression. They actually anointed, if I can use that word, I think David used it intentionally because he's talking about the Lord's anointed. But they actually rubbed oil on their shields. If they didn't have iron, remember that. If they were brass shields, it not only polished them, but it would make a blow that wasn't a direct blow actually deflect off the shield. And if they were leather shields, like so many of them were, it just kept the leather soft and supple instead of getting hard and cracked. And so that was a part of their general maintenance. And the picture that's painted here is that shield's now lying in the field, drying up because it's no longer being put to use. It's just beautiful poetic language. And 3 times, David uses this famous phrase, how the mighty have fallen. 3 times it's in that passage. If you wonder where that phrase came from, it's often used in political circles. It's often used in sports circles when the underdog wins, how the mighty have fallen. Now you know where it came from. It came from David's lament of Saul and Jonathan when they were killed. So David sings this lament. And then he wondered what to do. And so he inquired of God what should be done next. And God directed him to move to Hebron. Hebron is an interesting choice of cities to go to for a number of reasons. First of all, it's a famous old city in Israel because it was the dwelling place of Abraham centuries before. And it's where Abraham was buried. And it's where some of Abraham's children were buried and some of his descendants. And so it's a famous place in Israel for that regard. It's also in the territory of Judah, which is the tribe that David is from. And so it would be in friendly territory in that regard. But it's also, interestingly enough, a city of refuge. Now, Israel had certain cities of refuge where someone accused of murder could go, and he was protected against revenge until he could have a fair trial. And it's interesting that David would go to a city of refuge because maybe people might think that he was guilty and he would be protected there. So kind of an interesting choice, but that's where God directed him, and that's where he went. And it was in that city that David was anointed the king of Judah. It's not the king of all of Israel, but the tribe of Judah came. Now, Judah would include the tribe of Simeon because they shared the same territory. We learn later that it included some of the tribe of Benjamin, which is interesting since that was Saul's very own tribe. And we know it also included a number of Levites because the Levites were scattered all over the nation of Israel. And so parts of two full tribes and parts of two others, when it says Judah, are included in that. And the leaders came and they anointed him their king. He didn't assert himself. He went there and he waited for them to come to him. And we see that same picture again of waiting on God's timing because God is the one that anointed him. At the same time, Ishbosheth was anointed the king of Israel. You can read that in chapter 2, verses 8 to 11. Excuse me. Ishbosheth was Saul's only remaining son. He had 4 sons, and 3 of them died in the battle we just read about last week. And so the only remaining son was anointed king of Israel. He was anointed by Abner. Abner was the commander of Saul's army, but he was also Saul's cousin. And so he brings his cousin's son and anoints him the king of Israel. Now that doesn't settle the matter. Because if you've been following the story, you know that David was anointed the king of all of Israel. And so the matter isn't settled yet. In fact, the struggle continued for a number of years before things were settled. It's not until chapter 5 in this 2 Samuel where David actually becomes king of the entire nation. And there are some rough times in between. But that's where I want to stop the story today, because I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn, because they had a change in leadership. And it wasn't an easy change. And when leadership changes, a lot of things can change. And this story gives us some insight into what can happen and what should happen when leadership changes. So our lesson today is just that, when leadership changes, and I have 7 things to share. Number 1, this is extremely important. We're going to even talk about it again next week. When leadership changes, it is okay to grieve. It is okay to grieve. Please hear me, because a lot of you are looking at changes around you and you are grieving. And it's okay to grieve. David grieved. He instructed the people to grieve. He instructed his army to grieve. And since we're going through a change, it's okay to do that. In fact, it's good and it is necessary to do that. It is good and it is necessary. Everyone here is going to feel the changes, and there's probably something that you're going to miss or something you're going to lose in the changes. It's okay to grieve those things. There's nothing wrong with that. It's the natural process, and we should do it. It doesn't matter whether you voted for a merger or not. It doesn't matter how long you've been here. It might be harder for people that have been here longer. But there's going to be a grieving process. And allow yourself to have that process. And verbalize it. Now, I'm not giving you permission to complain. That's different. But it is okay to verbalize the loss you feel. And that's exactly what David did. He wrote it down. It says he recorded it in the book of Jasher. We don't even know what that is, but that's where it was recorded. It's okay. It's all right to do that. It's good, and it is necessary. What one guy wrote, he said, when I was in the Marine Corps, I was a public affairs officer, sometimes assisting the recruiting efforts. In North Carolina once, I asked a young Marine why he was returning to the Marine Corps. His answer was, no one's in charge on the outside. That's how it feels sometimes when change is going on, doesn't it? Nobody's in charge. You know, we serve a faithful God who's in control. And we have some incredible elders that are walking through this process with us, even though it may feel like it's not. When it feels that way, it's okay to grieve. Second point, some people are going to try to take advantage of new leaders. Some people are going to try to take advantage of new leaders. That's exactly what this Amalekite was doing. He's trying to get on the good side of the new guy. He thinks that's a way to get a reward or to get ahead. That's why he changed his story. It's kind of funny. I've been warned of a couple people that might warm up to me. And I honestly didn't say anything about any of you, okay? But I was warned about some people that may warm up to me because they want their way. But my advice is be aware that that can happen and avoid it, okay? Don't cozy up to the new elders or to Pastor Craig or Pastor Dave if you're doing it just because you have an agenda. Don't do it. It's going to catch up to you eventually. And yet, that's what some people are tempted to do. That's exactly what happened in this story. I've never heard this name. The lady's name is Marquette Reeves. Forbes calls her one of the top executive headhunters in America. So this is a gal that interviews people and places them in really high executive jobs. She knows how to do that. She wrote an article about change in leadership. She said, when there's a change in leadership, be true to yourself. Be real. The most common mistakes include the extremes: hiding out to escape scrutiny or going over the top and trying to befriend the new leader. That's exactly what happened here, going over the top to befriend the new leader. She says, simply show your value and your openness to a new direction and focus. The best advice is to just be you. That's what we need to be. Just be us. The Amalekite couldn't do that, but we can. So, number 3, honor what was good in past leaders. Honor what was good in past leaders. Listen to some of the phrases from this psalm that David wrote. He calls again Jonathan and Saul Israel's glory. He says the shield of the mighty was defiled. He calls Saul and Jonathan mighty warriors, which they were. He says in verse 23, Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely. In life and in death, they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. He recognizes their faithfulness to each other, particularly Jonathan's faithfulness to his father when his father was opposing his best friend. He points that out. He praises that. He praises them for their strength again in battle. And he says of Jonathan, you've been very pleasant to me. He praises him as a friend, recognizes him as a friend. And again, once more, that phrase, how the mighty have fallen. And of course, all the way through, he recognizes that Saul is the Lord's anointed ruler. Notice how this guy that was trying to kill him, he is putting in the best light. He's saying, look at all the good that was there, and he's honoring that good. We at Village have had just a number of great leaders over the years. And the years that I've been here, I've seen this. I shared this with you a few weeks ago, and I want to share it again because I so believe this true, that every church chairman that I've seen that we've had more than just a few months in a kind of a maybe transition between chairmans, everyone we've had for a more extended period of time, you can look back and see that God put that person there for a very specific reason, and sometimes a couple reasons. And I look at that and I go, that's just amazing. And that's how God works. And we need to honor that because we have had great leaders here and they could be honored for what they've done. On a related note, we need to honor what was done right as well. You may remember last week's story. I didn't mention it here. But in last week's story, the men from the city called Jabesh Gilead went to the battlefield, got Saul's body and Jonathan's body, and they gave him a decent burial that he wasn't going to get on the battlefield, particularly if the Philistines came and abused him. And so they took and gave him that burial. And David honored those men for doing that. You can see that in chapter 2, beginning in verses 4 or 5. Right there. He honored what was done right. You know, Village has done a lot of great things over the years. We've been in this community over 60 years, and some great things has happened. There's a great legacy in this community. We've been in this building 37 years. Had to go look at the cornerstone to remember that. But 37 years. And the leaders at Front Range wanted to honor that by making Village a significant part of our name as we came together. And they have done that. And we need to honor that legacy. We need to honor what was done right. One thing I know Village did so well is they had an impact in the early days on the baby boomer generation. And when this church was number-wise in its heyday, it was full of the baby boomer generation. I'm one of the baby boomers. I wasn't here, but I know how a lot of churches ignored my generation. And they didn't. They were effective at reaching that generation. And we can honor that as something that happened in the past. But I believe the best way to honor that is to say we want to extend that to different generations now. And we want to see that impact on a new generation. I think that's the best way to honor that. So honor what was good and honor what was done right. But there comes a time to move on. And when that happens, commitment is needed. Commitment to new leadership. The men of Judah in chapter 2, verse 4, came to David, and they anointed him king. They were committed to him, knowing that he had been anointed by God already as the king. And we have voted to be one congregation, not Village and Front Range, but one congregation. That takes commitment. It's okay to grieve. Takes time to do that, but take some time to commit as well, because that's what it takes, and that's what these men had done. But the last 2 points are that when leadership changes, adjustments are necessary. Adjustments are necessary. In chapters 2 to 5, we see the adjustments that were needed because the southern tribes, Judah and Simeon and so on, adjusted to the idea of David being their king pretty quickly, but the northern tribes didn't. They had a hard time transitioning their minds from the Saul dynasty to the David dynasty. And they struggled with that. And they needed to make some adjustments. And it was difficult at times. In fact, the last point is related to that. Adjustments can be difficult. It's okay to grieve. It's okay to struggle with adjustments. It's okay to recognize they're difficult, but we need to be flexible in that. Adjustments are not just difficult, they can be bumpy or messy or hard or any other word you want to put in there. Blended families always have bumps along the way. And for Judah and Israel, it actually meant a small war where lives were lost. It was a messy transition. There's a story that when the directors of the Cunard Luxury Liner Company had decided to name their new luxury ship the Queen Victoria. And so the directors of the company went to King George. This is Victoria's grandson. And they wanted to get permission from him to name their ship the Queen Victoria. And this is what they said. We've decided to name our new ship after England's greatest queen. You know what his response was? My wife will be thrilled. They suddenly changed the name to Queen Mary. And it passed up because I goofed you up, Kathy. There was a picture of it on the screen just a moment ago. If you don't know, the Queen Mary was one of the great luxury ships in the world that is now a hotel, I think in Long Beach, California, in the bay there, and a beautiful hotel there. But interesting story of the name. Leadership had a different idea, and they said, we better make an adjustment. And I think that's a beautiful story to illustrate that very thing. You know, the background picture for this series is something that Brittany chose when I told her what we were doing about politics and providence. And it's been up there week after week after week. And it was so appropriate because that's just half of it. But the battles that are going on are difficult. And we called it politics and providence because politics can be hard. And yet all the way through, God's hand was in everything that was happening, bringing about what he desired. Adjustments can be rough. But with God's help, blended families can become families. And that's what we believe God will do and can do. And that's what we hold on to. It's okay to grieve. Don't take advantage of new leaders. Do honor what was good and right in our past. But take time to commit to move ahead and remember that adjustments are needed.